A few years ago, my buddy Nate and I were driving late at night on a long stretch of highway. It was close to midnight, and we still had a little over an hour to go before we got to my cousin's place. The road was mostly empty, just an occasional car passing by, and Nate had been dozing off while I focused on driving. At some point, I noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road up ahead. The hazard lights were blinking, and both the driver's side and passenger's side doors were wide open. There was no one standing outside, no movement at all, just this car sitting there in the dark, looking completely abandoned. I nudged Nate awake and pointed it out. As soon as he saw it, he immediately asked if we should stop and see if someone needed help. I told him no. Something about it felt off, but Nate wasn't convinced. He started saying, "What if someone was hurt? Or what if a family was stranded?" He even reached for the door handle like he was actually about to get out and check. I had to tell him not to be an idiot. If someone needed help, we could call the cops. But we weren't stopping in the middle of nowhere for some sketchy-looking situation. He hesitated for a second, but finally let it go. I kept driving, watching the car fade into the darkness in my rearview mirror. The rest of the drive was quiet, but I could tell Nate was still thinking about it. At one point, he muttered something about hoping they were okay. I didn't say anything back. We got to my cousin's place late, crashed on the couch, and passed out. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the TV. Nate was already awake, just sitting there, staring at the screen. I asked him what was up, and he didn't even answer, just pointed. The news was covering a murder. A family of 4 had been found dead on Highway 35. A man, his wife, and their 2 kids. And then they showed a photo of the crime scene. It was the same damn car. Doors open, hazard lights on. I felt my stomach drop as the news anchor explained that this wasn't some broken-down vehicle or a family in distress. It was a setup. 4 men had been using the car as bait, waiting for someone to stop. 2 of them had been hiding in a ditch nearby, while the other 2 were inside the car. When the victims pulled over to help, they were ambushed, robbed, and shot. Nate and I didn't say a word. We just sat there, staring at the screen, knowing exactly how close we had come to being in that same situation. If we had stopped, if Nate had actually gotten out of the car, we wouldn't have made it to my cousin's place that night. If you're enjoying the video so far, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Any support would be greatly appreciated. A few years ago, I was staying at a cheap motel in the middle of nowhere after a long drive. It wasn't one of those big chain motels, just a small, sketchy-looking place off the highway with maybe 10 rooms, the kind where the doors all face the parking lot, and the guy at the front desk looks like he's been working there for 30 years. I checked in late, probably around 11:30 p.m., and got a room near the end of the building. The parking lot was nearly empty, just one other car a few spots down. The whole place had that weird, quiet vibe that immediately put me on edge. But I was exhausted and just wanted to sleep. As soon as I got to my room, I double-checked that the door was locked and latched. The place wasn't great. Stained carpet, flickering light in the bathroom, that weird, damp motel smell. But I didn't care. I was out within minutes. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. It took me a second to figure out what it was, but once I was fully awake, I realized someone was jiggling my door handle. Not just once, either. It was slow and deliberate, like whoever was outside was testing to see if it was locked. I just lay there, heart pounding, listening. The handle rattled again, this time a little harder. Then, nothing. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My first thought was that it was maybe a drunk guest who got the wrong room. After a few minutes of silence, I started to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge because of how creepy the motel was. But just as I was about to roll over and go back to sleep, I heard it again. Not at the door this time. At my window. The curtain was drawn, but there was a tiny gap where it didn't fully close. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, and watched. A shadow moved past the window. Someone was out there, standing just feet away from me, watching. At this point, I was fully freaking out, but I didn't want to move. I didn't want them to know I was awake. I reached for my phone as slowly as possible and called the front desk. The guy answered in this groggy, annoyed voice, but as soon as I whispered that someone was trying to get into my room, he went silent for a second. Then he just said, "Stay put. I'm coming." It felt like forever, but maybe a minute later I heard footsteps outside. The guy from the front desk started yelling, asking who the hell was out there. Silence. Then I heard running, fast footsteps sprinting away from my room toward the back of the building. A few seconds later, a car door slammed and tires screeched as someone peeled out of the parking lot. I waited until everything was quiet again before slowly opening the door. The front desk guy was standing there, looking pissed. He asked if I saw who it was, but I just shook my head. He told me this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Said people had reported seeing someone lurking around the motel late at night before, but they always took off before the cops showed up. I packed up my stuff and left immediately. I didn't care that it was 3 a.m. I was not staying there another second. I still don't know what they wanted. Maybe they were just trying to rob me. Maybe it was something worse. But to this day, I think about what would have happened if I had forgotten to lock the door. This happened a couple of years ago when I was renting a house in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. It was a nice enough place. Nothing fancy, but cheap rent, and I didn't have any roommates, which was a plus. At the time, I was working late shifts, so I'd usually get home around 1 or 2 a.m. Most of the houses on my street were dark by then, and the whole neighborhood had this eerie, almost abandoned feel to it at night. One night, I pulled into my driveway and immediately noticed something was off. The light in my bedroom window was on. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but I never left that light on when I went to work. I specifically remembered turning it off before leaving that night. I sat in my car for a second just staring at the window, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe there was some electrical issue. Then, as I was about to brush it off, something made my stomach drop. The light turned off. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, every hair on my body standing up. Someone was inside my house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone had broken in. They told me to stay in my car and wait for the police. So that's what I did. I locked my doors and kept my eyes glued to the house, heart pounding, watching for any movement. A few minutes later, I saw it. The front door cracked open just an inch. Not all the way. Not like someone was making a run for it. Just barely open, like whoever was inside was trying to listen. At that point, I was practically holding my breath. Then, slowly, the door closed again. No footsteps. No rush to escape. Whoever was in there wasn't worried about being caught. That terrified me more than anything. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. 2 officers got out and asked me to stay put while they checked the house. They drew their guns, went inside, and I just sat there, gripping my steering wheel so hard my hands hurt. After what felt like forever, they came back out. The house was empty. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing missing. The only weird thing was that the back door was unlocked, even though I was absolutely sure I had locked it before I left. The cops told me it was possible someone had gotten in, but without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I get the locks changed, then left. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I had a locksmith come and replace every lock on the house. I also went out and bought a cheap security camera to put by the front door, just in case. For a while, nothing else happened, and I started convincing myself that maybe I had forgotten to lock the back door, or maybe the light thing was just a weird electrical glitch. Then, about a week later, I was going through the security footage on my phone. I had mostly set it up for package theft, so I wasn't expecting to see much. But at around 3 a.m., the night before, the camera had caught something, a man, standing in my front yard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing completely still, facing my house. No mask, no hood, just a regular-looking guy in jeans and a jacket. He stood there for almost 10 minutes, without moving. Then, without stepping closer or trying to get in, he just turned and walked away. I moved out a month later. A few years ago, I was driving home late at night after visiting my parents. It was about a 3-hour drive, mostly back roads and highways with long, empty stretches. I had done this drive 100 times before, but that night, something happened that still freaks me out to this day. It was around 1 a.m., and I was maybe 45 minutes from home. There weren't many cars out, just me and the occasional truck passing by. The road was dark, no streetlights, just the glow of my headlights cutting through the night. That's when I saw the car. It was an older sedan, parked on the shoulder with its brake lights on. Nothing unusual at first, but as I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was wide open, and there was no one inside. I slowed down just a little, trying to see if someone was nearby. Maybe they had broken down and walked to get help. But as I passed, my headlights swept over something that made my skin crawl. There was a person crouched down behind the car. I only saw them for a split second, but it was enough. They were hiding, not standing by the hood, not waving me down for help. Hiding. Every instinct in me screamed, "Don't stop." I kept driving, checked my rearview mirror, half expecting them to step out onto the road, but they didn't. The car just sat there, its brake lights glowing red in the darkness. For the next few minutes, my heart was pounding. I kept replaying what I saw in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some guy fixing a flat tire? But why was he crouched down like that, perfectly still, like he didn't want to be seen? I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe I had imagined it. Then I saw headlights in my mirror. A car pulled onto the road behind me. At first, I thought it was just another late-night driver, but then I realized it was that same sedan. My stomach dropped. It sped up, getting closer, closing the distance between us fast. I was going about 60 miles per hour, but this guy was flying. Within seconds, he was right behind me, his high beams flashing. At this point, I was fully freaking out. I didn't know what he wanted, but I sure as hell wasn't stopping to find out. I pressed down on the gas, trying to put some distance between us. He stayed right on my tail. For the next 5 miles, he followed me, switching between riding my bumper and backing off, like he was messing with me. High beams kept flashing, almost blinding me in my mirror. I kept scanning the road ahead, hoping for another car or a gas station, something. But it was just darkness. Nothing but trees on either side. Then, up ahead, I saw a green road sign. It said there was a gas station coming up in 2 miles. I made a split-second decision. Instead of speeding up, I slammed on my brakes as hard as I could. The guy must not have expected it, because he swerved into the opposite lane to avoid rear-ending me. As soon as he did, I floored it. I don't know if he lost control or just didn't react fast enough, but I shot ahead and put some distance between us. My heart was pounding, and I kept my eyes on the gas station sign coming up. When I got close, I saw it was one of those 24-hour truck stops. Bright lights, a few semis parked outside. I took the exit and pulled in fast, parking right in front, near the entrance. I looked back at the road. The sedan flew past the exit, still going fast. He didn't stop. I sat there for a few minutes, hands shaking on the wheel, just watching to see if he'd turn around. He didn't. After a while, I went inside, got a coffee, and stayed there for a bit, just to be safe. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window in my house. To this day, I have no idea who that guy was or what he wanted, but I'm pretty sure that if I had stopped back when I first saw that car on the side of the road, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. A few years ago, I worked as a delivery driver for a medical supply company. My job was to drive around and drop off oxygen tanks, wheelchairs, and other medical equipment to patients who needed them at home. It wasn't a bad gig, decent pay, long hours, but most of the time, I was alone, which I didn't mind. One night, I had a delivery scheduled way out in a rural area. It was about an hour outside of town, mostly back roads and farmland, the kind of place where streetlights don't exist, and once the sun goes down, it's just pitch black darkness. I was supposed to drop off a hospital bed at a house in the middle of nowhere. The request had come in last minute, and the dispatcher told me it was urgent. The patient was being discharged that night, and they needed the bed ASAP. I didn't think much of it at first. It was common for late-night deliveries in this line of work. The house was at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by trees. No other houses nearby, no porch light on, just a dark, run-down-looking place barely visible against the night. I pulled into the driveway, left my headlights on, and grabbed my clipboard. Normally, someone would be waiting for me, especially if it was an urgent delivery, but there was no sign of anyone. I knocked on the front door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. At this point, I was getting annoyed. The dispatcher had made it sound like this was an emergency, but now no one was even answering the door. I was about to call the number on the order when I heard something. A noise coming from the side of the house. It sounded like rustling, like someone moving through the leaves. I turned my head, expecting to see the homeowner walking up from the backyard or something. But there was no one, just darkness and trees. I knocked one more time, and right as I was about to turn around and leave, I heard a voice. It was faint, coming from somewhere inside the house. A woman's voice, calling out, "Hello." I exhaled in relief. Finally, someone was home. I called back, telling her I had the delivery and needed a signature. She didn't respond right away, and for a second, I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. Then she spoke again, but something about her tone made me uneasy. "Come inside." I hesitated. Normally, I never went inside customers' houses. That wasn't part of the job. I was supposed to drop off the equipment at the door and leave. I told her she just needed to sign for it, and I could leave the bed on the porch. Silence. Then, after a long pause, she said the same thing in the exact same tone. "Come inside." Something was wrong. The way she said it, there was no urgency, no frustration, just this flat, emotionless voice, like she was reading from a script. I took a step back, suddenly very aware of how isolated this place was. Then I heard movement from the trees. Not just one or two footsteps, multiple. I turned my head and saw shapes shifting in the darkness. People, more than one, moving through the trees toward the house. My body went ice cold. I dropped the clipboard, ran back to my truck, and slammed the doors shut. As I threw it into reverse, my headlights swept across the front yard. And that's when I saw 4 or 5 people dressed in dark clothes, standing at the edge of the trees, just standing there, watching. I didn't stick around to count. I floored it, throwing gravel everywhere as I sped back down the dirt road. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following me, but no one came after me. When I got back to town, I pulled into a gas station and just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. I called my dispatcher and told him the house was abandoned and that no one was there to receive the delivery. I didn't mention the people. I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding insane. The order was canceled the next day. No explanation. The request just disappeared from the system like it had never existed. I don't know who those people were or what would have happened if I had stepped inside that house, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have come back out. A few years ago, I was driving through West Virginia on a solo road trip. I was moving across the country for a new job and figured I'd take my time, enjoy the drive, and see parts of the U.S. I'd never been to before. I was in no rush, and since I was on a budget, I mostly stayed at cheap motels along the way. One night, I was about 6 hours into a drive when I realized I was exhausted. I had planned to push through to the next big town, but I was fighting to keep my eyes open. I figured it wasn't worth the risk, so I pulled off at the next exit and started looking for a place to crash for the night. It was a small, quiet town, one of those places with a single gas station, a diner, and not much else. I found a cheap-looking motel off the highway and decided it would do. The parking lot was empty except for one car, an old sedan parked near the office. The motel looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Faded paint, buzzing neon sign, that kind of thing. But it was cheap, and I was too tired to be picky. I walked into the office, and this older guy behind the desk looked up from his newspaper. He barely said a word, just took my cash, handed me a key, and pointed toward my room at the far end of the lot. I grabbed my bag and walked over. The place was dead silent. No highway noise, no other guests, nothing. As soon as I stepped inside the room, I got this weird feeling. I don't know how to explain it, just that feeling you get when something's off. The room smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The furniture was old, the carpet was stained, and the whole place just felt wrong. But I told myself I was just overtired. I locked the door, double-checked that the window was shut, and got into bed. I must have dozed off pretty quick because the next thing I knew, I was waking up suddenly, like that feeling when you know something just startled you awake, but you're not sure what. I laid there for a second, trying to figure out what was wrong. Then I heard it, a soft click, like the sound of a door handle being turned. My heart started pounding. I turned my head toward the door. The chain lock was still in place, but the handle was moving. Someone was trying to open it very quietly. I shot up and grabbed my phone, but before I could even unlock it, the handle stopped moving. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking away from my door. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call the cops and look like an idiot if it was just a drunk guest trying the wrong door. But I also wasn't about to open it and check. I sat there, listening, for what felt like forever. Finally, after a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was fine. I was probably overreacting. I got up to use the bathroom, and on my way back to bed, I decided to check the window. The curtain was open about an inch. I knew I had closed it before going to sleep. At that point, I was done. I threw my stuff in my bag, grabbed my keys, and left. As I was pulling out of the parking lot, I glanced at the office window. The old guy was sitting behind the desk, staring at me. Not reading his newspaper, not watching TV, just watching me leave. I drove straight through the night, running on pure adrenaline, until I hit the next big town. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the motel. There were a few reviews, mostly bad, but one stuck out. It was from a woman who had stayed there a year before. She said she woke up in the middle of the night to find the motel owner standing in her room, watching her sleep. I have no idea what would have happened if I had stayed, but I don't think I want to know.